In the video, we can see that the man who drives the car acted carelessly, and this caused harm to the pedestrian. In other words, he failed to show reasonable care. In this situation, we can say without any doubts that it was the tort of negligence. Who is liable in this situation? The care that a reasonable person would exhibit was not performed, and it is fault of the driver. Also, the driver must be attentive, very careful and watchful during his drive on the road, especially at the intersections where there are a lot of pedestrians. The tort of negligence makes the defendant liable for failing to act reasonably. To successfully sue the defendant, the plaintiff must prove that all four elements of the four-part legal test were neglected: the duty of care, breach, causation, and damages. First, the duty of care. In this situation on the road, the defendant owed the plaintiff a legal duty of care. The driver should have anticipated the harm caused. In other words, the harm that occurred is the reasonably foreseeable consequence of the defendant's act. The second is the breach the standard of care. The defendant breached that legal duty by failing to act properly, in a way that would not harm the pedestrian. In this situation, a reasonable person would not do the same as the defendant under similar circumstances. The third is causation of damage. In the video, we can see that defendant's negligence caused injuries to the plaintiff. After the incident, we can see how the pedestrian is holding his back and barely walking. Moreover, the defendant could foresee that his or her actions might cause an injury to the pedestrian. Fourth, was the damage caused by the defendant. Since injuries suffered were foreseeable by the defendant, it makes him liable for the full extent of the plaintiff's injury. The financial loss that results from a negligent act where there has been personal injury damage to the person claiming the loss must be paid by the defendant. A breach of the standard of care is owed by defendant because he has the duty of care. Defendant failed to meet the standard of care because he or she did not stop before the crosswalk to pass the pedestrian. However, a reasonable person would stop and pass the pedestrian.
In the video, the victim has the right to sue the person who engaged in the hit and run crime. However, for what damages can the defendant be sued? As we can see in the video, the victim was hit by a car. This is a non-pecuniary damage. In other words, the defendant has to compensate the plaintiff for pain and suffering. After the hit, you can see that the victim was badly hurt. He tried to go further away from the road and was seen limping. After the incident, we can assume that the plaintiff was taken to the nearest hospital. This means the plaintiff can sue the defendant for pecuniary damages or, in other words, out-of-pocket expenses. We can also suppose that the victim not only suffered physically but also mentally, and the plaintiff has the right to sue the defendant for aggravated damages. There is a chance that the plaintiff can sue the defendant for punitive damage. However, can the victim prove that the crime was intentional, oppressive, or was it high-handed conduct? The victim had to comply with traffic rules. For example, it is seen in the video that the victim did look at the left side of the road before crossing, but completely forgot to check the right side at the time when the car was approaching. If the victim was more careful and attentive, he would have been able to avoid the incident. So yes, the victim was able to minimize damages. However, we cannot say that this is contributory negligence. The viewer would ask me why. Well, because the victim was crossing the road on the crosswalk, and as we all know, the driver must always make a full stop for people crossing the crosswalk. If the victim was crossing the road with a pedestrian cross, this means that the defendant would likely sue the victim for contributory negligence.